To say Gintama has a lot of characters would be an understatement, and to manage all of them at once would certainly be a difficult task. To evenly distribute screen time or panel time to each major character is impossible. There's so many characters that obviously some are gonna take the spotlight more than others. But nonetheless, today I wanted to examine the screen time of Gintama's central cast, comment on who was underdeveloped and deserved more, who was overdeveloped and perhaps deserved less, who should have maybe appeared elsewhere in the series, and generally what I would have changed if I had complete creative control over Gintama. And obviously, I am no expert, this is all in hindsight, just looking back at potential what-if scenarios surrounding Gintama's cast, looking at how each character was distributed across all of Gintama, and whether they did or did not get the appropriate screen time that they perhaps should have. So with that, let's get into it. Firstly, to set the basis, I wanted to find out the average number of episodes in which a given character appeared, to figure out a rough estimate as to how much focus they got over the course of the Gintama anime. Now, looking through literally all 369 episodes would take all day and then some, so I narrowed it down to a much smaller sample which went as follows. I used a random number generator 100 times, ignoring repeats, to get a random selection of 100 episodes, ignoring filler episodes to generalise from and extrapolate from there. Next I checked out what major characters appeared in the episode, ignoring cameos and flashbacks should they not be relevant, plotted them onto a graph, counted them up out of a maximum of appearing in all 100 episodes, which conveniently doubles up as a percentage. And just like that, we have an estimated percentage for each character's share of Gintama, the results of which are as follows. A shock to absolutely no one, Gintoki, Kagura and Shinpachi are the only characters to appear in over 80% of episodes, however maybe not as high as you might think. Gintoki appears prominently in 92% of episodes, 85% for Kagura and 84% for Shinpachi. Owing to episodes like 244, where Gintoki appears by himself, 205, where Kagura appears by herself, and even some like 101, 194, and 223, where not one of them appears. But moving on, and we have a significant drop down to the Shinsengumi. Kondo appears in roughly 38% of episodes, Hijikata in 36%, and Okita in 32%. In large part to Kondo featuring in episodes with Otai, Hijikata in episodes with Gintoki, and Okita kind of being left behind. And to speed through the rest of them, Katsura and Otai show up in a little under a third of episodes at 32% each, Hasegawa in 21% of episodes, Sachan and Yamazaki both in 20%, Elizabeth in 19%, in large part to always being with Katsura, both Kyubei and Otase in 18% of episodes, Sadaharu in 17%, Matsudaira in 13%, Tsukio in a surprisingly low 12%, which we'll get onto later, Takasugi in 11%, Catherine at 10%, Utsuro or Shoyo, I grouped them together, in 9% of episodes, albeit incredibly concentrated towards the end of Gintama, much like Takasugi. Mutsu in 8% of episodes, funnily enough, above Sakamoto at 7%, due to episode 324 where she appears by herself, but for all intents and purposes they should be the same. 7% for Tama, 6% for Umibozu, Gengai, Kamui and Zenzo, and finally 5% of episodes include Oboro, the Shogun, Sasaki or Nobume. Now is this a comprehensive study? No, not at all. I could have done all 369 episodes for an entirely representative sample, and I say this because, coincidentally, someone did exactly that on the Gintama subreddit earlier today as of the writing of this video, so I'll link that in the description if anyone's interested. But nonetheless, after that exceptionally long intro, let's unpick some of these results. Firstly, Gintoki, Kagura and Shinpachi obviously are not underdeveloped or in need of any more screen time. They are the protagonists and show up pretty much every episode, so let's move on. The Shinsengumi, on the other hand, are a bit of an odd one, considering Kondo technically gets more screen time, yet he's arguably the least explored of the trio. Hijikata is at the centre of Shinsengumi Crisis and the Thorny arc, Okita is at the centre of the Okita Mitsuba arc, and even the smaller Rokaku arc, but despite Kondo's prominent role in Farewell Shinsengumi, he's much more comedic centred than the other two, and therefore, if I had to sway either way, I would argue Kondo is slightly underdeveloped. Unlike the other two, we get very little backstory surrounding him. And ultimately, I think he could have done with the same treatment Okuta got as the star of the show in the Okuta Mitsuba arc. I think a more serious arc purely revolving around him as the protagonist would have done well to further develop his character. But I digress, it's not a huge concern. But overall, I think the Shinsengumi are balanced pretty well as a complementary trio to our main trio, whereby if we calculate what percentage the Shinsengumi show up in any capacity, it comes out to 47% of episodes, which sounds about right. But then, moving to Katsura, and despite having a fair amount of screen time, its placement within the story of Gintama, I would argue, also leaves him slightly underdeveloped. What I mean by this is that there is a 250 episode gap between the Benizakura and Farewell Shinsengumi arcs, where he is completely absent from any more grounded, serious role, which in my opinion was a big missed opportunity. Now, obviously, of the original shoujo students, Ginsuki and Takasugi were always going to be at the forefront, but even still, I think Katsura was used far too much for his comedic role at the expense of more serious appearances in some of the major arcs. Much like Kondo, if we had an arc with him at the centre, much like how we had the Beam Sword arc with Shinpachi as the protagonist, I think that would have been incredibly valuable to his character, or even as a more major part of an already existing arc. And ultimately, I think it would be fair to say Katsura is the most misplaced character in the series, in the sense that sure he appears quite a lot, but where and when he appears leads me to consider him underdeveloped if I had to swing either way. Especially considering Otai has a relatively similar frequency in Gintama, despite being far less significant to the plot. In retrospect, with Katsura, small tweaks, like appearing perhaps as often as Hijikata, and shifting ever so slightly away from his comedic role once in a while, would have been pretty nice to see. But then again, I just want to quickly reaffirm the fact that I'm saying this from a perspective of a teenager with no knowledge of the internal workings of Sadachi and his writing of Gintama. Balancing so many characters at once is all but impossible, so I'm well aware my comments in this video are incredibly hypothetical and idealised. But nonetheless, moving on to Hasegawa, who, again, would have been nice to see play a more serious role more often than he did, but then again, it does kind of go against his character archetype in the first place. Besides, a lot of his development comes in the form of individual one-off episodes, like episode 188. And the same could be said of Sachan and Yamazaki. Sachan got fantastic character development in the Shogun Assassination arc, in addition to her typically comedic role, and Yamazaki being a subordinate character to the main Shinsengumi trio means there's not much else you can do with him. But then Elizabeth, and also Sadaharu, kind of fall into the same camp in the sense that they only show up so often because their owners, so to speak, are as prevalent as they are, although it is surprising how often Elizabeth shows up in particular. Obviously, Elizabeth is a gag character who, by that very premise, doesn't require any character development, but even still, we do have some of the weirder arcs, like the Renho arc, that do indeed develop her character somewhat, if you can call it that. And while we're on the topic, Sadaharu is surprisingly low down in terms of screen time. Again, he doesn't really need development considering he's, well, a dog, but even still, it is an interesting observation in the sheer gap from any one of Ginsuki, Kagura and Shinpachi showing up in 95% of episodes, whereas Sadaharu only shows up in 17%. But I digress as we move on to Kyubei. Certainly one of the more interesting and dramatic shifts in character usage in Gintama, considering I think it's a bit of a shame we never saw her in a more serious position after her introduction in the Yagyu arc. Whereas someone like Katsura, albeit a far more significant character, has a huge gap between more major appearances, Kyubei's gap is indefinite. Following the Yagyu arc, we don't see her in a more serious role ever again, instead only really showing up as a more comedic character. Which is fair enough, the end of the Yagyu arc marked her complete shift as a person anyway. She has a complete shift in personality and tone of character, but I think seeing her take up the sword as a prominent character in another major arc later on would have been a neat little addition. And then Otasei, I'd say, is a good example of doing a lot with very little. We get development with her as early as episode 11, and obviously we get a lot regarding her in Kabukicho for Divas and beyond, so I think her screen time is pretty justified. And the same could be said of Matsudaira. Given the relatively little screen time he has, it's used to great effect, first as a comedic character, and then later on taking on a far more significant role, both in Shogun Assassination and Farewell Shinsengumi, towards the end of the series. But then we come to Tsukio, who's an interesting one that I can't quite make up my mind on. In some ways, her character is almost the complete opposite of the likes of Kondo, Katsura, among others. She has very prominent roles in multiple major arcs, like Yoshiwara in Flames, Red Spider, and Courtesan of a Nation. But on the other hand, she has a surprisingly low overall screen time, considering she is, in my opinion, one of the best developed side characters in the entire series. Which I suppose you can attribute to the fact that at any given time, she's either a central character or not there at all. Unlike, say, Kondo, who shows up all the time despite seldom being the focus of an episode, Tsukio rarely shows up but is always a key character, often in isolation as the only other major character besides Ginsuki, Kagura, and Shinpachi. So therefore, is she underutilized, or is her character development so dense and compact that statistics don't really paint the full picture? I don't know, but I'll be inclined to believe the latter. She doesn't show up often, but when she does, she's at the forefront of the episode. Although, in all honesty, if I was forced to lean either way towards her having more screen time, or even less screen time, I would definitely love to see her in more episodes than she actually appeared. Only being in about 12% of episodes, less than the likes of Otasei and Yamazaki, is a bit of a crime. But anyway, to a certain extent, the same idea of rich, dense character development can be applied to Takasugi, who in early Gintama shows up once every 50 episodes or so, until becoming much more prominent towards the end, culminating in the events of Shogun Assassination and beyond. His lack of screen time is a strength in itself. I've already discussed this at length in previous videos, but his subtlety in early parts of Gintama make the bombshell of his development in Shogun Assassination hit that much harder. Despite being the main antagonist of most of the story, his relatively low screen time is pretty justified, I'd say. And by extension, the same could be said of Utsuro or Shoyo, who shows up only a few times in the first couple hundred episodes in flashbacks, before being heavily featured much later on as the central antagonist all the way until Gintama the final. But to skim through a few other major characters who I would argue deserved a greater presence in Gintama, Sakamoto, I would say, is the most obvious character, to the point where his lack of screen time is a joke within Gintama itself, and a bit like Takasugi and Utsuro, he only shows up on a regular basis right towards the end of Gintama, so it would have been nice to see him show up as a more prominent character beforehand. The only earlier arc where he features at the forefront is the Renho arc, and even still, that's not a particularly serious arc to begin with. But at least later on, arcs like the Kaientai and Rakuyu arcs do a lot for his character, although you could argue too little too late. Despite Sakamoto and Mutsu not being major characters to begin with, they are certainly some of the more underutilized characters that I think would have benefited from a greater presence in Gintama. And with a lot of these final characters, considering they were introduced so late into the series, Nobume for instance all the way in episode 245, it's hard to judge their screen time, considering they are confined to the end of the series to begin with. And in the case of Sasaki and Nobume, their development and role within Gintama is pretty fantastic regardless, showing up in 3 major arcs, all culminating in Sasaki's death at the end of Farewell Shinsengumi, and the same could be said of Kamui and Umibozu. They show up incredibly infrequently, but when they are used, their presence is more than certainly felt. They're never there just for the sake of being there, like some other characters. Instead, they always make a tangible impact on the plot, or on another character, or at least something of note. And to finally wrap this all up, one perhaps surprising character that I think should have got maybe a little bit more focus is Tama, who, in my opinion, is the most underrated character in all of Gintama, both in terms of comedy and her roles in a few more serious arcs. First and foremost, simply, she is just a funny character to begin with, who always makes a fantastic addition to comedy arcs like the Confessional arc, but also to more major arcs like the Gintama arc, and therefore showing up in only about 7% of episodes is a little low in my opinion. But with that being said, those are all the characters that I would personally give a greater degree of screen time and focus in Gintama if me, someone who has no idea what they're talking about, had complete creative control over Gintama. But then, to wrap up this video, in order to offset certain characters getting an increased presence in this hypothetical version of Gintama, we then need to work out the far more controversial matter of who gets less attention. Now, there are a few easy pickings that I would personally choose to replace their screen time with others. Of note, Otai gets a lot of screen time despite not being particularly important, and other minor characters that don't contribute much, like Catherine and Gengai, can also get cut down a bit, and honestly, even Ginsuki could be brought down just a tiny bit to let other characters act as the protagonist for an episode or two here and there, something that Gintama does exceptionally well to begin with, compared with many other shonen that only put the main character in the spotlight literally all the time. And to balance it all out, characters like Matsurara, Elizabeth and Otase could also be cut down ever so slightly, and with that, we are finished. Am I correct in my opinions? Probably not, but I'll be intrigued to see what you think in the comments below. Which characters would you place greater emphasis on, and who would you cut down to make those suggestions work? So with that being said, I'll be back in the next video. See ya!